books by Stephen King and Anne Rice, Dean Koontz. With reference to Stephen King, one of the police officers testified that he found that strange. So we're building the case here. They went to the library. The police went to the library and got Damien's records of what he had been checking out. And he had bought at a library sale a book called Once Upon a Broomstick about witches in Salem. And he had other kind of books dealing with magic and the occult. He was clearly very interested in it. And around that, they were building their case. So, the most important thing for their case, as referenced later by the Arkansas Supreme Court, which seemed to accept it entirely, was the testimony of a man named Dr. Dale Griffiths. Now, Dr. Griffiths claimed to have a PhD in the occult, and a friend of mine at the law school here said, "Well, that's kind of like having a PhD in ghost busting." Even at trial, the defense attorneys, who were not very well prepared, there were all kinds of problems with their preparation for this case, which one of them has roundly acknowledged. But they were able to establish that Dr. Griffiths had gotten his PhD basically from a mail-order university, the kind that advertised in the back of comic books and magazines, and asked whether he had ever attended a class to get his PhD. No, there was no campus for this university, and he had never written a paper for it either. He also claimed to have written several books, which he had not. And nonetheless, and that university has existed only for a few years, just long enough to accredit him, I guess. But even with all of that exposed, Judge Burnett accepted Dr. Griffiths as an expert and allowed him to testify. And I think that's one of the great disgraces of this case for Arkansas, that we not only accepted this charlatan as an expert, and I think it shows a bias on the part of Judge Burnett, and but our Arkansas Supreme Court, knowing the challenges that the defense attorney raised about his credentials, the Arkansas Supreme Court was still willing to accept him as an expert witness. Wasn't going to second guess the trial court. And so his testimony stood, and it was repeated at length in the appeals in this case, as with all kinds of statements saying, starting off with, as Dr. Griffiths said. So he carried a great amount of weight, and he testified that the murders bore trappings of the occult. Now, it's very interesting what he said the trappings of the occult were. First of all was that full moon. Another trapping of the occult was that there were 3 victims, and we know that 3 is a mystical number. One of the lawyers said, well, it's also kind of a big thing in Christianity too, isn't it? There was blood and water involved, and that was about enough to seal it. The defense asked, did you find pentagrams, for instance, or any other little occultish symbols carved on trees or somewhere in the vicinity? No, the police had not found any of that. Candle wax, pieces of robes, anything that might more tangibly than the moon and the 3 and the blood and the water represent a trapping of the occult, and there was not. But it worked. Essentially, the prosecutors created this syllogism that the murders were these trappings of the occult. Damien, those books by Stephen King and Anne Rice, and Wearing Black, and I think he had a skull of an animal in his bedroom. He was clearly a dabbler in the occult, and therefore he and Jason committed the murders, and it had to be and Jason because of Jesse's confession, which they had now just won their first case on, claiming that it was the two of them. So that was basically what won the day for the prosecutors there. They knew they had big problems here, and they were worried about a lot of them. But I love this. In trying to address the lack of evidence, in fact, at the start of one of the trials, Prosecutor Fogelman had told the jury, now you're going to see a lot of what we call negative evidence. That is evidence that doesn't seem to relate to anyone or anything. And I'm going to explain, that sounds strange, but I'm going to explain it to you later. But he never did explain it. And then by the time they get to the end of the trial, he's still worried about it because there is so much evidence that seems to not relate to anybody. Like they put bikes up there in front, and the bikes just sat there for the jury to look at and be reminded the 3 children who had once been riding those bikes were now dead. Nobody disputed that. But, so here's what he says. They make a big deal about there's no evidence at the scene. But think about it a minute. It's not that there's no evidence connection their client, because what evidence was found out there connects to one of these two, for the most part. What they want you to do is say there's no evidence, but there's no evidence out there that points to anybody else. If someone else had committed the crime, then you'd see the evidence that didn't connect, and you don't have that. There's the logic of this case. That is it. But the jury, and you can imagine, I actually have a lot of sympathy for the jurors here. Remember, there was that picture on the front page of the knife coming out of the leg. There were these 3 murdered children. The families were sitting in the courtroom. And those jurors knew they were going to have to walk out of there and face their community at the grocery store and everywhere else. And it was going to be very hard to say that with such distinguished citizens as Brent Davis and John Fogelman working so hard to say that these 3 guys had committed the crimes, for any juror to say, well, we just didn't think there was enough evidence to convict them. Anyway, Fogelman, in his closing argument, went straight to the satanic stuff. He really wanted to portray Damien as a lethal killer. And he told me afterwards that he felt Damien was weird. He felt Damien was scary. He said that many times. He pointed to Damien and told the jury, you see that person and you see there's not a soul in there. That kind of language strikes my ear as the language of the Inquisition. And there is much about this case that seems to me to echo hysteria and a willingness to exploit it. Okay. Prosecutors asked the jury to sentence both Damien and Jason to death. The jury did find them guilty. It did sentence Damien to death. Here he's being suited up in a bulletproof vest to leave the court. And it sentenced Jason